Following the capture of Acre in 1191, King Richard I of England was aware that he needed to capture the port of Jaffa before making an attempt on Jerusalem. Richard began to march down the coast from Acre towards Jaffa in August. Saladin, whose main objective was to prevent the recapture of Jerusalem, mobilized his army to attempt to stop the Crusaders' advance. Richard organized the advance with attention to detail. A large part of the Egyptian fleet had been captured at the fall of Acre, and with no threat from this quarter he could march south along the coast with the sea always protecting his flank. Mindful of the lessons of the disaster at hand, Richard knew that his army's greatest need was water and that heat exhaustion was its greatest danger. Although pressed for time, he proceeded at a relatively slow pace. He marched his army only in the morning before the heat of the day, making frequent rest stops, always beside sources of water. The fleet sailed down the coast in close support, a source of supplies and a refuge for the wounded. Aware of the ever-present danger of enemy raiders and the possibility of hit-and-run attacks, he kept the column in tight formation. During the march, the Crusaders were provoked and tormented by the skirmish tactics of Saladin's archers. Richard's generalship ensured that order and discipline were maintained under the most difficult of circumstances. Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad, the Muslim chronicler and eyewitness, describes the march. The Muslims discharged arrows at them from all sides to annoy them and forced them to charge, but in this they were unsuccessful. These men exercised wonderful self-control. They went on their way without any hurry. Baha al-Din also described the difference in power between the Crusader crossbow and the bows of his own army. He saw Frankish infantrymen with from 1 to 10 arrows sticking from their armored backs marching along with no apparent hurt, whilst the crossbows struck down both horse and man amongst the Muslims. The Crusader army's pace was dictated by the infantry and baggage train. The Ayyubid army, being largely mounted, had the advantage of superior mobility. Efforts to burn crops and deny the countryside to the Frankish army were largely ineffective as it could be continuously provisioned from the fleet. From 26th to the 29th of August, Richard's army had a respite from attack because while it hugged the coast and had gone round the shoulder of Mount Carmel, Saladin's army had moved across country. Saladin arrived in the vicinity of Caesarea before the Crusaders, who were on a longer road. From the 30th of August to the 7th of September, Saladin was always within striking distance, and waiting for an opportunity to attack if the Crusaders exposed themselves. By early September, Saladin had realized that harassing the Frankish army with a limited portion of his troops was not going to stop its advance. In order to do this, he needed to commit his entire army to a serious attack. Fortuitously for Saladin, the Crusaders had to traverse one of the few forested regions of Palestine, the wood of Arsuf, which ran parallel to the seashore for more than 20 kilometers. The woodland would mask the disposition of his army and allow a sudden attack to be launched. The Crusaders traversed half of the forest with little incident, and they rested on the 6th of September with their camp protected by the marsh lying inland of the mouth of the river Nahr el-Falik. Modern estimates of Saladin's army place it at around 25,000 soldiers, almost all cavalry. It is estimated that Richard's army consisted of around 10,000 infantry and around 1,200 heavy cavalry. The vanguard of the Crusader army consisted of the Knights Templar under Robert de Sable. Forming the rearguard were the Knights Hospitaller led by Garnier de Nablus. The first Saracen attack did not come until all the Crusaders had left their camp and were moving towards Arsuf. The Ayyubid army then burst out of the woodland. The front of the army was composed of dense swarms of skirmishers, both horse and foot, Bedouin, Sudanese archers, and the lighter types of Turkish horse archers. Behind these were the ordered squadrons of armored heavy cavalry, which included Saladin's Mamluks, Kurdish troops, and the contingents of the emirs and princes of Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. The repeated Ayyubid harrying attacks followed the same pattern. The Bedouin and Nubians on foot launched arrows and javelins into the enemy lines. Crusader crossbowmen responded. when the incessant attacks of skirmishers failed to have the desired effect. The weight of the attack was switched to the rear of the Crusader column, with the Hospitallers coming under the greatest pressure. Here the right wing of the Ayyubid army made a desperate attack on the squadron of Hospitaller knights. Saladin, eager to urge his soldiers into closer combat, personally entered the fray, accompanied by 2 pages leading spare horses. Saladin's brother was also engaged in actively encouraging the troops. Both brothers were thus exposing themselves to considerable danger from crossbow fire. All Saladin's best efforts could not dislocate the Crusader column. Richard was determined to hold his army together, forcing the enemy to exhaust themselves in repeated charges, with the intention of holding his knights for a concentrated counterattack at just the right moment. There were risks in this, because the army was not only marching under severe enemy provocation, but the troops were suffering from heat and thirst. For the Crusaders, the Battle of Arsuf had now entered a critical stage. Garnier de Nablus repeatedly pleaded with Richard to be allowed to attack. He was refused. The master was ordered to maintain position and await the signal for a general assault. 6 clear trumpet blasts. Richard knew that the charge of his knights needed to be reserved until the Ayyubid army was fully committed, closely engaged, and the Saracens' horses had begun to tire. Whether through a lack of discipline or acting on Richard's delegated authority, the orders marshal and one of Richard's household knights, Baldwin le Caron, moved through their own infantry and charged into the Saracen ranks with a cry of St. George. They were then followed by the rest of the Hospitaller knights. Moved by this example, the French knights of the corps immediately preceding the Hospitallers also charged. Richard recognized that the counterattack, once started, had to be supported by all his army and ordered the signal for a general charge to be sounded. Unsupported, the Hospitallers and the other rear units involved in the initial breakout would have been overwhelmed by the superior numbers of the enemy. To the soldiers of Saladin's army, as Baha al-Din noted, the sudden change from passivity to ferocious activity on the part of the Crusaders was disconcerting, and appeared to be the result of a preconceived plan. Some of Saladin's cavalry had dismounted in order to loose their arrows more effectively. As a result, the Ayyubids suffered great numbers of casualties, the knights taking a bloody revenge for all they had had to endure earlier in the battle. By this point, Saladin's army was in a complete rout. Being aware that an over-rash pursuit was the greatest danger when fighting armies trained in the fluid tactics of the Turks, Richard halted the charge after about 1.5 kilometers had been covered. Freed from the pressure of being actively pursued, many of the Ayyubid troops turned to cut down those of the knights who had unwisely drawn ahead of the rest. Amongst the Ayyubid leaders who rallied quickly and returned to the fight was Taqi al-Din, Saladin's nephew. He led 700 men of the Sultan's own bodyguard against Richard's left flank. The Crusaders countercharged and drove them back. Saladin's men did another similar charge, but this time they were sent back for good and they dispersed into the hills in all directions, showing no inclination to continue the conflict. By the end of the battle, the Crusaders had suffered around 700 killed, whereas it is estimated that Saladin's army suffered as many as 7,000 killed. Arsuf was an important victory. The Ayyubid army was not destroyed, despite the considerable casualties it suffered, but it did rout, and this was considered shameful by the Muslims and boosted the morale of the Crusaders. Saladin had to evacuate and demolish most of the fortresses of southern Palestine as he realized he could not hold them. By depriving Saladin of the coast, Richard seriously threatened Saladin's hold on Jerusalem. Although the Third Crusade, in the end, failed to retake Jerusalem, a 3-year truce was eventually negotiated with Saladin. The truce, known as the Treaty of Jaffa, ensured that Christian pilgrims from the west would once again be allowed to visit Jerusalem. Saladin also recognized the Crusaders' control of the Levantine coast as far south as Jaffa. Both sides had become exhausted by the struggle. Richard needed to return to Europe in order to protect his patrimony from the aggression of Philip of France, and Palestine was in a ruinous state.